Some of you may remember being here on October 19th when Tom Goldsmith preached a sermon called Decline, an Honest Appraisal of Long Life. One of the centerpieces of his remarks came from an article in The Atlantic by a medical ethics professor named Ezekiel Emanuel, and the title of his article was "Why I Hope to Die at 75." Well, I wasn't here on October 19th, but the word got out to me. So I did YouTube his sermons. Do you all know that you can read all the sermons on YouTube of Tom, or even the ones that I give? And Dr. Emanuel's point was, there is this myth in America that you have to learn to live as long as you can, and it ought to cost your kids as much as possible in those last years. And he was basically saying, in spite of the fact that his kids are screaming and kicking about his plans, at the age of 57, he's already figured out how his life is going to change at age 75. He said, at 75 and beyond, I will need a good reason to even visit the doctor and take any medical test or treatment. And it's not going to be a good enough reason that it will prolong your life. It better prolong the quality of your life. In short, he says, no life-sustaining interventions. Not going to get any screenings or tests. I might accept palliative care. I was glad to hear that because I'm a hospice chaplain and I work with palliative care physicians and nurses, and they do a great job. After 75, he says, if I develop cancer, I will refuse treatment. No cardiac arrest, no pacemaker, no implantable defibrillator, no heart valve. And he goes on about all the stuff, no flu shots, no vaccines, no antiviral drugs, no antibiotics. And he finally, after he gets through no, he says, after 75, I plan to die when whatever comes first takes me. Well, I have been thinking about what it was like to be 57 and thinking about age 75. And now that it's upon me, I'm thinking, what was I thinking at age 57? I do realize that Dr. Manuel's training is primarily in medicine, so he tends to view us primarily as bodies. Oh, yeah, and there's that thing about a mind. Spirit, they didn't have that in medical school when he was coming along. But there is, he points out rightly, a moral dilemma about the financial cost and the growing consensus in our country about physician-assisted suicide. And there's something magnanimous about saying, I would rather my income go to my kids or my charities, someplace where it can do some good and not on just keeping me alive. So I admire what I call a nonviolent, passive resistance right up to the end. We believe in that when it comes to justice. Nonviolent, passive resistance toward dying. But I also came to realize that, in my view, 57 is way too late to be thinking about planning to be 75. I think you ought to go back to about age 5. Those who study human development realize that in those first few years of life, you develop your concepts of trust and mistrust. Who can you trust and who can you mistrust, and who is a mixture, and you have to make, it's going to be real hard to figure out which is which. You learn about being your own person by the time before you even start to school. You learn how to take initiative and be rewarded for it by caregivers who you trust. Or to feel guilt. Every time I try something new, I'm going to get in big trouble, so I just better stay as conventional as I can. By the time you're in school, you either learn industry because there's something you're good at. You don't have to be good at everything, but there's something you're good at, and you develop self-confidence. Or nobody ever tells you what you're good at, and you live lifelong with a sense of inferiority. So you go on through life. As an adult, a young adult, you're learning about how am I going to combine education, career planning, finding a partner, intimacy, knowledge about the world, all at the same time. Well, if you've done all of these things pretty well up to now, you can sort of draw on everything that you've ever experienced before that time. And that's how you get through the rest of life. I'm summarizing a set of stages that were developed by a developmental psychologist by the name of Erik Erikson. And he has 8 stages of life. And the last one ends at 65 until death. So do the math. Here's your first 30 years, and then here's your second 35 years, and then there's this wild blue yonder for the last however many years. His research was assisted by his wife, Joan, and after he passed away, she wrote a book and added a 9th stage and said there's a lot more going on after you're 65, particularly if all the previous stages have been going along and you've learned a great deal to bring to it. And so she came up with a term, gerotranscendence, G-E-R-O, like gerontology, transcendence. So how do you transcend old age? That's what she was saying. In her book, The Life Cycle Completed, she introduced this term. And ever since then, researchers have followed how aging people face the deterioration of their bodies and their faculties, but they reach into a new stage that they couldn't have had before, called gerotranscendence, and it's defined as a shift in perspective from a materialistic and rational vision to a more cosmic and transcendent one, normally followed by an increase in life satisfaction. What they basically say is, when you get to be about my age, you have got a lot of stories to tell. And there may be several generations that haven't heard them before. And in my case, a lot of my stories, the people that I grew up listening to, they're all dead. So I'm safe to tell these stories. Stories, you see, can inform people's emotional lives. Novels, particularly, allow people to peek into someone's conscience to see how other people think. The more you learn how other people think, the more broadly you can think, and the greater your empathy can come. There was a psychology researcher by the name of Dan Johnson who recently published a study that found that reading fiction significantly increased empathy towards others, especially people the readers initially perceived as outsiders. So you learn that there aren't any outsiders, they're just people in books you haven't read yet. And they're just people in societies you just haven't encountered yet. A recent study in Science magazines adds more support to the idea that stories can help people understand others. Literary fiction, quote, uniquely engages the psychological processes needed to gain access to characters' subjective experiences. That is, the more you read novels, the better your ability to read your own emotions and emotions of others. Finally, there was a professor of marketing at Stanford Graduate School of Business who said that people remember information when it is weaved into narratives up to 22 times more than facts alone. So you know why you can't remember those memos and those emails you got from somebody really important? Because they were just full of facts, and you can't remember them. Suggest to those people who have power in your life, if you would like to get us to cooperate, we can do it 22 times better if you'll just tell us a story. In my book, Life Spirals, I devote a chapter to how to tell stories. I give 3 types of stories: vignettes, anecdotes, and sayings stories. A vignette is like a still photo. Somebody asks you, do you remember so-and-so, or do you remember visiting such and such? And a picture, a still picture. Yeah, I remember that. That's a big vignette. An anecdote adds time and space to your memories. So it is like, I can remember that person, I can hear their voice, I can see them running around, I know how they dressed, I know what their place of where they lived. So there's foreground and background as well as the middle ground where the individuals stay. And then finally, there are sayings, stories, where something that happened in this story and you learned a lesson that you've never forgotten. Here's a vignette from before I was 5. My first Sunday school teacher was a woman who came up to Kansas City from the Ozarks during World War II so her husband could work in the bomber plant. And he had come to church wearing these white overalls that they used in the factory. She came into our little basement classroom, and I always remember she would walk over to the door and she'd pick up a really nice looking homemade apron. And she would hang it over and she would tie it, and then she would sit on a chair and gather all of us little 4-year-olds on the floor. And then she'd take out her old beat-up Eagermeyer's Bible story book and put it on that apron. And it was so ratty and so fallen apart and dusty, I could see now why she needed to have an apron. She didn't want her nice church clothes messed up. But she would smile, and she'd look at us, and she'd tell this story and turn the pages. And she wasn't reading them. She just knew the story so well that all she had to do was just, they're there if you need it. What I realize is that church, good, healthy church for me, is Cassie Wagner and a bunch of people that are loved and some really interesting stories. I looked later on, I realized, I sort of judged my undergraduate professors. How good of stories can they tell? My Harvard Divinity School scholars, even the people in Tübingen in the Catholic and Protestant and Marxist faculties, I wanted to hear their stories. If I could just get their story, then I was willing to read their scholarly articles. So thank you, Cassie, for making my life a lot more interesting. I can remember an anecdote where I can see people moving. Also in about that same period of time, but it was shortly after World War II, so it was in the late 1940s. Well, some of the folks from the Ozarks were still around. And I learned that how to snap my fingers when I led the singing. Arliss Thompson, walking in sunlight, all of my journey over the mountains. Well, here I'm sitting in a pew and I'm kind of learning how to snap my fingers where nobody can see them. But we also had a choral director, an orchestra conductor, who also led the songs sometimes. And he would sing Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and all those back of the book hymns, and he could lead with 2 hands. And they sort of were mirror images of each other. And I would sit there and try to figure out how to do that. So eventually that church split into a blue-collar church and a white-collar church. But while I was growing up, I appreciate the fact that David somehow picked up on that, because we sing some finger-snapping songs, and we sing some classics. And I appreciate both, and I never have understood why people would go away when they had that opportunity. Finally, a story where I learned a lesson by seeing something happen. Occasionally in the summer times, us kids in my family would move from Kansas City out to the farm for a few weeks in Oak Grove, Missouri. And the farmhouse had a big front living room and bedrooms up above, and then a big, what used to be a log cabin, which was the country kitchen in the back. So one day, I was kind of quiet. I went into the living room. There was my Aunt Mattie Steinhauser standing there with her hands on her hips, just staring at a wall. Well, you know, grown-ups are always doing stuff like that. So I left until I heard this loud screeching noise. And that got my attention, and I came back. And I still couldn't find her. Where was she? Well, in front of the front doors, there is a set of stairs that goes right to the second floor where the bedrooms are. She was down on her hands and knees with a claw hammer, and she was pulling the risers up, and they were not going quietly. And so eventually she had all the risers pulled up, and she pulled up, what do you call those things, you know, on the sides? She pulled all those up, and by the end of the day, she had turned the stairs around so that they were in the central hall, going up to the upstairs. Because, number one, the cold air blows right straight up, and people don't have any place to put their clothes, but now they have a guest closet right inside the front doors. And she has a place to run up and put the linen right close to the washer. And it was something, this is not the Golden Gate Bridge, but for a kid, I have never forgotten that sometimes you can just stand and stare a problem down and don't let it beat you. So I would like to hope that some of you will start remembering what are the anecdotes, the vignettes, and the sayings stories in your life. Don't wait till you're 57 like this poor, pitiful doctor and not have any stories that make him think, well, you think there's anything I could do, be a mentor, be a consultant, just be a boring old man telling racy stories about what life used to be? Like Charlie Smith talked about, yeah, we used to take tonsils out with baling wire. Really, tell us more. You know. So that's what I want to challenge you to do. Discover Giro Transcendent. Get ready for it now, whatever age you are. Start noticing. Start remembering. Start telling stories to your heart's content. You don't have to get it right. I can remember my mom and dad. Howard, it wasn't raining that day. It was sunny, remember? Because I had the sheets out on the line in the sun. It doesn't matter. Well, it does. It matters if you get entitled to your own version. Be ready to tell your life to people your age and others. Start now to discover that in your life there are currents that flow on in endless song.